Brooklyn thought she knew what heartbreak felt like. She was wrong. The text message she accidentally saw on her daughter's iPad would shatter everything she believed about family. Her 8-year-old Madison was getting baptized this Sunday, and Brooklyn wasn't invited. How do you explain to a mother that she's not welcome at her own daughter's most sacred moment? Brooklyn's ex-mother-in-law Helen had organized everything behind her back. Just 2 years ago, Brooklyn and Madison were inseparable. Sunday mornings meant pancakes and church together. But Helen never thought Brooklyn was good enough for her son Tyler. From day one, she made that crystal clear. When Brooklyn's marriage fell apart, Helen didn't hesitate to blame her for everything that went wrong. Now Madison was caught in the middle of a war Brooklyn never wanted to fight. But reading that text about the baptism was the moment Brooklyn realized Helen had crossed a line she couldn't ignore. Brooklyn scrolled through every message, every email, looking for any mention of this sacred ceremony. There was nothing, not a single invitation, not even a courtesy call. Helen had systematically excluded Brooklyn from her own daughter's spiritual milestone. This was about more than just a ceremony. This was about erasing Brooklyn from Madison's life completely. Madison had no idea that the two most important women in her life were at war. Brooklyn knew she had to make a choice. Fight for her place in her daughter's life, or let Helen win. But Brooklyn had no idea that Helen's plan to destroy her went deeper than she could have ever imagined. Helen had been building a case against Brooklyn, collecting what she called evidence of her failures as a mother. The lies Helen had spread about Brooklyn to their church family would leave her speechless. But Brooklyn still didn't know the worst part that was coming. The betrayal that would nearly break her forever. Before we continue with Brooklyn's story, we'd love to know where you're watching from today. Please drop your location in the comments. And if this story is touching your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. To understand how Brooklyn's world came crashing down, we need to go back to where it all began. 5 years ago, she was the happiest bride in Dallas, walking down the aisle toward Tyler Richardson. Brooklyn believed she was marrying into a loving family that would welcome her with open arms. She had no idea that Helen Richardson, her future mother-in-law, had already decided that Brooklyn wasn't worthy of her precious son and never would be. That wedding day would mark the beginning of a silent war that would consume their lives and eventually destroy everything Brooklyn held dear about family and love. Even on Brooklyn's wedding day, Helen Richardson sat in the front row with a look that could freeze hell over and shatter dreams in seconds. While everyone else celebrated the beautiful union with tears of joy, Helen was already plotting ways to prove that this marriage was a catastrophic mistake that would ruin her family's reputation. She whispered venomous comments to relatives about Brooklyn's modest background, her job as a nurse, and how she clearly wasn't sophisticated or wealthy enough for the Richardson family name. The poison was spreading through the family before Brooklyn even said her vows, and Helen's campaign to destroy her had officially begun. Tyler Richardson was everything Brooklyn had dreamed of in a husband and life partner. Successful, kind, handsome, and completely devoted to making her happy. He worked as a financial advisor and came from one of Dallas's most prominent and wealthy families. But Tyler had one fatal flaw that would ultimately destroy their marriage. He could never stand up to his domineering mother, no matter what the consequences. Helen had controlled every aspect of his life since childhood, and marriage wouldn't change that unfortunate reality. Tyler genuinely believed his mother only wanted what was best for everyone involved and couldn't see her true manipulative nature. When Brooklyn became pregnant with Madison 2 years into their marriage, she thought things might finally change for the better. Surely becoming a grandmother would soften Helen's heart and bring them together as one happy family. But Helen saw the pregnancy as another golden opportunity to assert her control and prove Brooklyn's inadequacy as a wife and future mother. She criticized Brooklyn's prenatal choices, questioned every parenting book she read, and even suggested that Brooklyn wasn't emotionally stable enough to raise a Richardson child properly and safely. The psychological attacks were relentless and designed to break Brooklyn's confidence completely. The moment Madison was born, Helen swooped in like a vulture, claiming her most precious prize. She insisted on being present for every milestone, every doctor's appointment, every precious first moment that should have belonged to Brooklyn as the mother. Helen would arrive unannounced at Brooklyn's home, criticizing everything from the baby's feeding schedule to the temperature of the nursery, and even the colors Brooklyn had chosen. Brooklyn felt like a guest in her own motherhood experience, constantly judged and found lacking in Helen's cold, calculating eyes. The woman was systematically trying to replace Brooklyn as Madison's primary maternal figure. Brooklyn tried desperately to voice her concerns to Tyler, but he dismissed her feelings as postpartum hormones and new mother stress that would pass with time. He couldn't see how his mother's constant interference was slowly poisoning their marriage from the inside out like a deadly cancer. Tyler genuinely believed Helen was just being helpful and supportive during a difficult transition, completely blind to the manipulation and control that was destroying his wife's confidence and mental health. The gaslighting had begun in earnest, and Brooklyn was losing herself in the process, while Tyler remained oblivious to her pain. Helen's tactics became increasingly sophisticated and psychological as Madison grew older. She would undermine Brooklyn's parenting decisions in subtle ways, suggesting alternative approaches that made Brooklyn second-guess herself constantly and feel inadequate. Helen would tell Tyler privately that Brooklyn seemed overwhelmed and might need professional help, planting seeds of doubt about his wife's capabilities as a mother. The psychological warfare was relentless and methodical, designed to slowly erode Brooklyn's confidence and position within the family structure. Helen was playing a long game, and she was winning every single battle. The arguments between Brooklyn and Tyler became more frequent, more intense, and more devastating to their relationship. Brooklyn felt like she was fighting an invisible enemy that her husband refused to acknowledge existed or posed any threat. Tyler accused Brooklyn of being jealous of his mother's relationship with Madison, completely missing the point that Helen was systematically trying to replace Brooklyn as the primary maternal figure. The marriage was crumbling under the weight of Helen's manipulation, and Tyler couldn't see what was happening right in front of his eyes. Brooklyn was drowning in isolation and despair. The final breaking point came when Helen openly contradicted Brooklyn's discipline of Madison in front of the entire extended family during a holiday gathering. Helen told Madison that her mother was being too strict and that Grandma would handle things differently and more lovingly. Brooklyn realized in that devastating moment that she would never win this war while staying in this toxic marriage. Tyler's silence during that humiliating moment told Brooklyn everything she needed to know about where his loyalties truly lay. Her husband had chosen his mother over his wife, and there was no coming back from that betrayal. Brooklyn filed for divorce 6 months later, heartbroken but determined to reclaim her life and her role as Madison's mother before it was too late. But Helen saw this as the ultimate victory and the perfect opportunity to completely eliminate Brooklyn from Madison's life forever. What Brooklyn didn't realize was that Helen had been documenting every argument, every moment of frustration, every tear Brooklyn had shed, building a comprehensive case to prove that Brooklyn was an unfit mother who had abandoned her family. The real war was just beginning, and Helen had been preparing for this battle for years. Brooklyn's hands trembled as she dialed Tyler's number, her heart pounding with a mixture of rage and desperation that threatened to consume her completely. She had discovered the baptism plans less than 24 hours ago, and the betrayal cut deeper than any wound she had ever experienced in her life. How could the father of her child, the man she had once loved with all her heart, allow his mother to exclude her from such a sacred moment in Madison's young life? The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before Tyler's familiar voice answered, sounding tired and distant as if he already knew this conversation was coming and dreaded every second of it. Tyler's voice carried a defensive tone that Brooklyn recognized all too well from their marriage counseling sessions and countless arguments about his mother's interference. He immediately went into damage control mode, explaining that Helen had convinced the entire family that it would be better for everyone involved if Brooklyn wasn't present at the baptism ceremony. According to Helen's carefully crafted narrative, Brooklyn's presence would only create unnecessary drama and tension during what should be a peaceful and joyous religious celebration for little Madison. Tyler genuinely seemed to believe that excluding Brooklyn was somehow an act of kindness rather than the cruel manipulation it truly represented. Brooklyn felt her world crumbling as Tyler revealed the depth of Helen's manipulation and the extent of her own isolation within what used to be her family. Helen had spent months poisoning the well, telling relatives that Brooklyn was unstable, vindictive, and potentially dangerous to Madison's emotional well-being and spiritual development. She had painted Brooklyn as a bitter ex-wife who would use any opportunity to cause chaos and disruption during important family events. The lies were so pervasive and convincing that even Tyler's own siblings, people who had once welcomed Brooklyn into their family, now viewed her as a threat to their peace and Madison's happiness. What Brooklyn didn't know was that Helen had been working behind the scenes for months, carefully orchestrating this moment of ultimate exclusion and humiliation. Helen had told the church that Brooklyn was no longer a practicing Christian and might disrupt the sacred ceremony with inappropriate behavior or emotional outbursts. She had convinced the extended family that Brooklyn's presence would traumatize Madison and create lasting psychological damage during what should be one of the most beautiful moments of her young spiritual life. Helen's web of lies was so intricate and believable that no one questioned her motives or thought to verify her claims about Brooklyn's character and intentions. The conversation with Tyler lasted nearly an hour, and with each passing minute, Brooklyn felt her heart breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. Tyler revealed that Helen had presented what she called evidence of Brooklyn's instability, including screenshots of emotional text messages Brooklyn had sent during their divorce proceedings and photos of Brooklyn crying during custody exchanges. Helen had twisted normal human emotions and reactions into proof of mental illness and unfitness as a mother. Tyler admitted that he sometimes wondered if his mother was right about Brooklyn needing professional help, and those words hit Brooklyn like a physical blow to her chest. Tyler seemed genuinely conflicted during their conversation, torn between his loyalty to his mother and some remaining affection for Brooklyn as the mother of his child. He admitted that he sometimes missed their family and wondered if they had made the right decision to divorce. But he always came back to his mother's warnings about Brooklyn's supposed instability and potential danger to Madison. Helen had convinced him that Brooklyn's emotional responses to losing her daughter were actually signs of mental illness rather than normal maternal grief and desperation. Tyler had been so thoroughly manipulated that he couldn't distinguish between Helen's lies and his own observations anymore. As the conversation continued, Brooklyn began to understand the full scope of Helen's campaign against her and the systematic way she had been erased from her own daughter's life. Helen had convinced Tyler that supervised visitation wasn't enough protection for Madison, and that Brooklyn's emotional volatility made her unsuitable for important family events and religious ceremonies. Every tear Brooklyn had shed, every moment of justified anger, every plea for more time with her daughter had been weaponized against her by a woman who saw Brooklyn as nothing more than an obstacle to be eliminated. The realization was devastating and infuriating in equal measure. What Brooklyn couldn't have known was that Helen had been documenting everything for months, building what she considered an airtight case against Brooklyn's fitness as a mother. Helen had screenshots of every emotional text message, photos of Brooklyn looking disheveled during difficult custody exchanges, and detailed notes about every moment when Brooklyn had shown any sign of distress or desperation. She had even recorded some of their phone conversations without Brooklyn's knowledge, capturing Brooklyn's tears and pleas for more time with Madison. Helen was building a legal case to permanently remove Brooklyn from Madison's life, and the baptism exclusion was just the beginning of her master plan. By the end of their conversation, Brooklyn felt completely defeated and more alone than she had ever felt in her entire life. Tyler made it clear that he supported his mother's decision about the baptism and believed it was in Madison's best interest for Brooklyn to stay away from family events until she could prove her stability and commitment to peaceful coexistence. He suggested that Brooklyn seek therapy and anger management counseling, parroting Helen's talking points about Brooklyn's supposed mental health issues. The man she had once loved and trusted was now completely under his mother's control, unable to see the truth even when it was staring him directly in the face. After hanging up the phone, Brooklyn sat at her kitchen staring at the wall for what felt like hours, trying to process the magnitude of what she had just learned about her life and her future. She wasn't just excluded from a baptism ceremony. She was being systematically erased from her daughter's life by a woman who had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation and psychological warfare. Brooklyn realized that this was bigger than just missing one important event. This was about Helen's ultimate goal of completely eliminating Brooklyn from Madison's life forever. The war for her daughter's heart and future had escalated to a level Brooklyn never could have imagined, and she was losing every single battle. 2 days after that devastating phone call with Tyler, Brooklyn knew she had to take matters into her own hands and confront Helen directly, no matter how uncomfortable or dangerous it might prove to be for her emotional well-being. She drove through the affluent neighborhood where Helen lived, past manicured lawns and luxury cars, feeling like an outsider in a world that had once welcomed her as family, but now viewed her as an unwanted intruder. Brooklyn's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as she pulled into the circular driveway of Helen's imposing mansion, the same house where she had once brought Madison for happy family gatherings that now felt like distant memories from another lifetime entirely. She knew this confrontation could go badly, but she had to try one last time to reach whatever humanity might still exist within Helen's cold heart. Helen answered the door with an expression of genuine surprise that quickly transformed into barely concealed disgust and irritation at finding Brooklyn standing on her pristine doorstep. She was impeccably dressed, as always, every hair in place, every piece of jewelry carefully chosen to project wealth and status that she believed elevated her above people like Brooklyn who had to work for a living. Helen's cold gray eyes swept over Brooklyn's appearance with obvious disdain, taking in her modest clothing and the signs of stress and sleepless nights that had marked Brooklyn's face over the past few months of this ongoing custody battle. The older woman's body language made it clear that Brooklyn was not welcome in her home, and that this unexpected visit was nothing more than an unwanted interruption to her carefully planned and perfectly ordered day. Brooklyn swallowed her pride and begged Helen to reconsider her decision about the baptism, explaining that missing such an important milestone in Madison's spiritual life would be devastating beyond words for any mother to endure. She spoke from her heart about how much Madison meant to her, how every day without her daughter felt like a piece of her soul was being torn away, and how she had never done anything to deserve being excluded from the most sacred moments of her child's young life. Brooklyn promised that she would behave perfectly during the ceremony, that she would sit quietly in the back of the church and not cause any disruption or drama that might interfere with the solemnity of the religious service. She even offered to undergo counseling or therapy if that's what it would take to prove her stability and commitment to peaceful coexistence with Helen and the rest of the Richardson family. But Helen's response was like ice water thrown in Brooklyn's face, cold and shocking in its complete lack of human compassion or maternal understanding. Helen calmly explained that Brooklyn's exclusion from the baptism was just the beginning of a much larger plan to protect Madison from what she called toxic influences and unstable maternal figures who might damage the child's emotional and spiritual development. She told Brooklyn that a real mother would put her child's needs above her own selfish desires for attention and recognition, completely twisting the natural maternal bond into something pathological and dangerous. Helen's words were carefully chosen to inflict maximum psychological damage, designed to make Brooklyn question her own motives and worthiness as a mother, while painting Helen as the protective grandmother, simply trying to do what was best for an innocent child. As the conversation continued, Helen revealed the true depth of her hatred and the extent of her long-term plans for Brooklyn's complete elimination from Madison's life forever. She spoke with chilling calmness about how she had been documenting Brooklyn's erratic behavior and emotional instability for months, building what she believed was an airtight case for the courts that would eventually result in the complete termination of Brooklyn's parental rights. Helen described Brooklyn's natural maternal emotions, her tears during custody exchanges, her desperate pleas for more time with Madison, her anger at being systematically excluded from family events, as evidence of mental illness that posed a clear and present danger to Madison's well-being and future happiness. The older woman's voice never wavered as she outlined her plan to destroy Brooklyn's life with methodical precision. Helen led Brooklyn into her home office and showed her a thick folder filled with what she called evidence of Brooklyn's unfitness as a mother and potential danger to Madison's safety and emotional stability. The folder contained screenshots of every emotional text message Brooklyn had ever sent, photos of Brooklyn looking disheveled during difficult moments, detailed notes about every time Brooklyn had raised her voice or shown any sign of frustration during custody exchanges, and even recordings of phone conversations that Helen had made without Brooklyn's knowledge or consent. She had documented every tear, every moment of desperation, every natural human reaction to losing one's child, and twisted them all into proof of mental illness and maternal inadequacy. The thoroughness of Helen's campaign was both impressive and absolutely terrifying in its cold calculation and complete lack of empathy. As Brooklyn looked through the folder with growing horror and disbelief, she realized that Helen had been planning this systematic destruction of her life and relationship with Madison for far longer than she had ever imagined possible. Some of the documentation went back to before the divorce was even finalized, suggesting that Helen had been collecting evidence against Brooklyn from almost the moment she had married into the Richardson family. Every family gathering, every interaction with Madison, every moment of Brooklyn's life had been scrutinized and documented by a woman who had never intended to accept her as a legitimate member of the family. Helen had been playing a long game from the very beginning, and Brooklyn was just now beginning to understand the true scope of the psychological warfare that had been waged against her. Helen's final revelation was the most chilling of all. She told Brooklyn that she had already consulted with several family law attorneys about pursuing a case for the complete termination of Brooklyn's parental rights based on her documented mental instability and potential danger to Madison's well-being. She explained that Tyler was fully supportive of this plan and believed it was necessary to protect their daughter from further emotional trauma caused by Brooklyn's erratic and unpredictable behavior during custody visits and family interactions. Helen gave Brooklyn an ultimatum that was designed to be impossible to accept: voluntarily surrender all parental rights and disappear from Madison's life forever, or face a prolonged and expensive legal battle that would expose every private moment of Brooklyn's grief and desperation to public scrutiny and ultimately result in the same outcome anyway. Brooklyn felt the room spinning around her as the full impact of Helen's words sank into her consciousness like poison spreading through her veins. This wasn't just about missing a baptism ceremony or even losing custody of Madison. This was about the complete and permanent destruction of her identity as a mother and her legal right to even see her own child ever again. Helen wasn't just trying to win a custody battle. She was trying to erase Brooklyn from existence as far as Madison was concerned, to rewrite history so that Helen became the primary maternal figure in the child's life, while Brooklyn became nothing more than a cautionary tale about unstable women who couldn't handle the responsibilities of motherhood. The psychological cruelty was breathtaking in its scope and devastating in its potential consequences for both Brooklyn and Madison. Brooklyn stumbled out of Helen's house in a state of complete emotional shock and psychological devastation, her legs barely able to carry her to her car as the full magnitude of her situation crashed over her like a tidal wave of despair and terror. She sat in her car in Helen's driveway for several minutes, sobbing uncontrollably as she tried to process what she had just learned about her future and her daughter's fate. Helen had declared total war on Brooklyn's existence as a mother, and she had the resources, connections, and documented evidence necessary to potentially win that war in court. Brooklyn realized that she was facing the fight of her life, not just for custody or visitation rights, but for her very identity as Madison's mother and her legal right to exist in her daughter's world. The stakes couldn't be higher, and Helen held all the cards in this deadly game of psychological chess. Brooklyn drove straight to Savannah's house after leaving Helen's mansion, her hands still shaking from the encounter and her mind reeling from the devastating revelations about Helen's systematic plan to destroy her life completely. Savannah took one look at Brooklyn's tear-stained face and red-rimmed eyes and immediately pulled her best friend into a fierce protective embrace, not needing any explanation to understand that something terrible had just happened. For the next 2 hours, Brooklyn poured out everything that had transpired during her confrontation with Helen, describing in painful detail the folder of evidence, the threats about terminating parental rights, and the chilling realization that Helen had been documenting and manipulating every aspect of Brooklyn's life for years. Savannah listened with growing horror and anger, her protective instincts flaring as she watched her dearest friend crumble under the weight of psychological warfare that no mother should ever have to endure. Savannah's initial shock quickly transformed into righteous fury as she processed the full scope of Helen's manipulation and cruelty toward Brooklyn and Madison. As Brooklyn's closest friend since college, Savannah had witnessed firsthand the loving, devoted mother that Brooklyn had always been, and she knew that every single one of Helen's accusations was not only false, but maliciously designed to destroy an innocent woman's life. Savannah had watched Brooklyn sacrifice everything for Madison's happiness, had seen her work double shifts as a nurse to afford dance lessons and art classes, had witnessed countless sleepless nights when Brooklyn worried about every aspect of her daughter's well-being and development. The idea that anyone could twist Brooklyn's natural maternal love and concern into evidence of mental illness filled Savannah with a protective rage that burned hotter than anything she had ever felt before in her life. Savannah refused to let Brooklyn give up without a fight, reminding her that Helen's psychological warfare was built on lies and manipulation rather than any actual evidence of wrongdoing or maternal inadequacy. She pointed out that everything Helen had documented, Brooklyn's tears, her emotional pleas for more time with Madison, her frustration with the custody situation, were completely normal reactions that any loving mother would have when being systematically separated from her child by a vindictive ex-mother-in-law. Savannah reminded Brooklyn of all the wonderful memories they had shared watching Brooklyn raise Madison with such love and devotion, all the sacrifices Brooklyn had made to ensure her daughter's happiness, and all the evidence of Brooklyn's character that existed in the hearts and minds of people who truly knew her. She insisted that Helen's documentation told only one side of a carefully manipulated story and that the truth about Brooklyn's love for Madison would ultimately prevail if they could find the right way to fight back. That very evening, Savannah began her own investigation into Helen's activities and reputation within their community, determined to uncover the truth about the woman who was systematically destroying her best friend's life. She started by reaching out to mutual acquaintances and carefully asking questions about Helen's behavior and comments regarding Brooklyn and the custody situation. What Savannah discovered was deeply disturbing. Helen had been spreading her poisonous narrative far beyond just the immediate family, telling anyone who would listen that Brooklyn was mentally unstable, potentially dangerous, and completely unfit to be around children. She had painted herself as the heroic grandmother protecting an innocent child from a dangerously unhinged mother, and many people in their social circles had believed her lies without question because of her reputation and social standing in the community. Savannah's investigation revealed that Helen had been particularly active at their church, spreading rumors and lies about Brooklyn's mental state and fitness as a mother to anyone who would listen to her carefully crafted sob story. Helen had told the pastor that Brooklyn had threatened to disrupt Madison's baptism, that she had sent disturbing and inappropriate messages to Tyler, and that she had exhibited erratic behavior during custody exchanges that frightened Madison and caused the child to have nightmares. None of these claims were true, but Helen's reputation as a pillar of the community and a generous donor to church activities gave her words considerable weight and credibility among the congregation. Savannah realized that Helen had been conducting a sophisticated character assassination campaign for months, systematically poisoning Brooklyn's reputation in every sphere of her life, while positioning herself as the concerned grandmother simply trying to protect an innocent child from harm. When Savannah shared her findings with Brooklyn, Something shifted in Brooklyn's demeanor for the first time since this nightmare had begun. A spark of hope and determination began to flicker in her eyes as she realized that she wasn't completely alone in this fight. Knowing that Helen's campaign was built on lies and manipulation rather than actual evidence gave Brooklyn the first glimmer of hope she had felt in months. Savannah had not only validated Brooklyn's experience and confirmed her sanity, but she had also provided concrete evidence that Helen's accusations were part of a deliberate and systematic campaign of psychological warfare designed to isolate Brooklyn and turn everyone against her. For the first time since discovering the baptism exclusion, Brooklyn began to believe that there might be a way to fight back against Helen's manipulation and reclaim her rightful place in Madison's life before it was too late to save their mother-daughter relationship. Savannah immediately began developing a comprehensive strategy to counter Helen's lies and expose the truth about her character assassination campaign against Brooklyn. She suggested that they needed to document everything, every lie Helen had told, every person she had manipulated, every piece of false evidence she had manufactured to support her narrative about Brooklyn's supposed mental instability. Savannah proposed that they reach out to people who knew Brooklyn well and could testify to her character, her devotion to Madison, and her stability as a mother and person. She also recommended that Brooklyn begin keeping her own detailed records of every interaction with Helen, Tyler, and Madison, creating a paper trail that would demonstrate the truth about the custody situation and Helen's manipulative behavior. Most importantly, Savannah insisted that they needed to find allies within their community who could help expose Helen's lies and support Brooklyn's fight for her daughter. As the evening progressed and Savannah's plan took shape, Brooklyn felt her confidence and determination slowly returning after months of feeling helpless and defeated by Helen's psychological attacks. She realized that she had been so isolated and gaslighted by Helen's manipulation that she had begun to doubt her own memories and perceptions of reality. Having Savannah validate her experiences and confirm that Helen's behavior was indeed abusive and manipulative gave Brooklyn the strength to start fighting back instead of simply accepting defeat. Brooklyn understood that this battle would require every ounce of courage and determination she possessed. But for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt like she had a chance to win back her daughter and expose Helen's lies to the world. The war for Madison's future was far from over, but Brooklyn was no longer fighting alone against an enemy who seemed impossibly powerful and well-connected. Savannah immediately began putting their plan into action by reaching out to their mutual friends and acquaintances who had been affected by Helen's rumor campaign. She carefully approached people who had seemed uncomfortable or confused by Helen's stories about Brooklyn, sensing that not everyone had completely bought into the older woman's narrative about Brooklyn's supposed mental instability and unfitness as a mother. Savannah discovered that several people had indeed found Helen's claims about Brooklyn difficult to believe, given their own positive experiences and interactions with Brooklyn over the years. Some had even expressed private concerns about Helen's intense involvement in the custody situation and her obvious animosity toward Brooklyn, wondering if the older woman might be overstepping boundaries and interfering in matters that should be resolved between Brooklyn and Tyler as Madison's parents. These conversations gave Savannah hope that they could build a network of supporters who would be willing to speak the truth about Brooklyn's character when the time came to fight Helen's lies in court. As Brooklyn prepared to leave Savannah's house that night, she felt more hopeful and determined than she had in months, finally believing that she might have a chance to save a relationship with Madison and expose Helen's manipulation for what it truly was. Savannah had not only provided emotional support and validation during Brooklyn's darkest hour, but she had also given her a concrete plan of action and the beginnings of a support network that could help her fight back against Helen's lies and character assassination. Brooklyn realized that Helen's greatest weapon had been isolation, making Brooklyn feel like she was completely alone and that everyone believed the lies about her mental state and fitness as a mother. But now Brooklyn knew that she had at least one person who believed in her completely and was willing to fight alongside her for the truth and for Madison's future. The battle ahead would be difficult and potentially devastating, but Brooklyn was no longer facing it alone, and that made all the difference in her determination to reclaim her rightful place as Madison's mother. 3 days later, Brooklyn gathered every ounce of courage she possessed and decided to attempt something that terrified her more than any confrontation with Helen ever could. She would try to see Madison at school during pickup time, hoping to catch just a few precious moments with her daughter before Helen's surveillance network could intervene and destroy this opportunity. Brooklyn's hands trembled as she parked across the street from Madison's elementary school, watching through her windshield as children began streaming out of the building at the end of the school day, their backpacks bouncing and their voices filling the air with the joyful chaos that only children can create. She spotted Madison almost immediately, her curly brown hair catching the afternoon sunlight as she walked slowly toward the pickup area, looking smaller and more fragile than Brooklyn remembered from their last supervised visit weeks ago. Brooklyn's heart ached with a physical pain that took her breath away as she watched her daughter from a distance, desperate to run to her, but terrified of causing a scene that might traumatize Madison or give Helen more ammunition for her character assassination campaign. Madison seemed different somehow, more subdued and withdrawn than the vibrant, chattering child Brooklyn remembered from before this custody nightmare had begun consuming their lives. As Brooklyn watched from her car, she noticed that Madison kept looking around the pickup area with an expression of confusion and longing that broke Brooklyn's heart into a million pieces. It was clear that Madison was looking for someone, and Brooklyn realized with a devastating clarity that her daughter was looking for her, wondering why her mommy never came to pick her up from school anymore like she used to do before the divorce tore their family apart. The innocence in Madison's eyes as she searched the crowd of parents and caregivers for a familiar face that would never appear made Brooklyn's chest tight with grief and rage at the injustice of their situation. This beautiful, innocent child had no understanding of the adult war being waged around her, no comprehension of why her mother had suddenly disappeared from the most basic routines of her daily life, and no way to process the confusion and abandonment she must be feeling every single day. Brooklyn couldn't stand watching her daughter's confusion and apparent sadness for another second, and she made the impulsive decision to cross the street and approach Madison despite the potential consequences of defying Helen's implicit ban on her presence at school functions and activities. As she walked across the parking lot, Brooklyn's heart pounded with a mixture of desperate love and paralyzing fear. Love for her daughter, who she missed more than life itself, and fear of what Helen might do if she discovered this unauthorized contact between mother and child. Brooklyn had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, imagining what she would say to Madison, how she would explain her absence without traumatizing the child or speaking negatively about Helen and Tyler, and how she would make the most of whatever precious seconds they might have together before the outside world intervened to separate them once again. Every step toward Madison felt like both a victory and a potential disaster, but Brooklyn's maternal instincts overrode every rational concern about the potential consequences of this desperate act of love. The moment Madison spotted Brooklyn approaching, her entire face transformed with pure joy and relief that made Brooklyn's heart soar and break simultaneously with the intensity of their connection. Madison dropped her backpack and ran toward Brooklyn with the uninhibited enthusiasm that only a child can possess, her arms outstretched and her voice calling "Mommy," with such happiness and surprise that several other parents turned to watch the reunion with curiosity and, in some cases, obvious recognition of the emotional significance of this moment. Brooklyn caught Madison in her arms and held her as tightly as she dared, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter's hair and feeling the solid warmth of the child's body against her chest for the first time in what felt like an eternity of separation and longing. For those few precious seconds, nothing else existed in the world except the pure love between a mother and her daughter, the connection that no amount of legal manipulation or psychological warfare could ever truly destroy, no matter how hard Helen tried to sever their bond permanently. Brooklyn knelt down to Madison's eye level, fighting back tears as she looked into her daughter's innocent hazel eyes and saw both joy at their reunion and confusion about why these meetings had become so rare and precious. Madison's first question cut straight to Brooklyn's heart. "Mommy, why don't you come to my school anymore?" Why don't we have pancakes on Sunday? When are you coming home? The innocence and directness of these questions made Brooklyn realize how impossible it was to explain the adult complexities of custody battles, character assassination, and psychological warfare to an 8-year-old child who simply wanted her mother back in her daily life. Brooklyn struggled to find words that would reassure Madison without lying to her, that would express her love without making promises she might not be able to keep, and that would provide comfort without revealing the devastating truth about Helen's systematic campaign to eliminate Brooklyn from Madison's life entirely. The conversation was both the most precious and most painful experience Brooklyn had endured since this nightmare began, a bittersweet reminder of everything she was fighting to preserve and protect. Brooklyn's precious time with Madison was brutally interrupted when Helen appeared seemingly out of nowhere, her face twisted with cold rage and righteous indignation as she witnessed this unauthorized contact between Brooklyn and Madison. Helen had clearly been monitoring the school pickup routine and had either followed Brooklyn or been alerted to her presence by one of the many allies she had cultivated through her rumor campaign and character assassination efforts. The older woman strode across the parking lot with the determination of a general leading troops in a battle, her expensive heels clicking against the asphalt like gunshots, and her entire demeanor radiating the kind of controlled fury that promised swift and devastating retaliation for this perceived violation of her carefully established boundaries. Brooklyn saw Helen approaching and felt her stomach drop with the knowledge that this beautiful moment with Madison was about to be destroyed, and that her daughter was about to witness another painful separation that would only add to the child's confusion and emotional trauma. Madison sensed the tension immediately, her innocent mind picking up on the adult emotions swirling around her, even though she couldn't understand their source or significance in a larger battle being waged for her future. The child looked back and forth between her mother and her grandmother with growing confusion and fear, her earlier joy at seeing Brooklyn rapidly transforming into anxiety as she realized that something was very wrong with this situation. Madison could feel the anger radiating from Helen and the fear emanating from Brooklyn, and her 8-year-old mind couldn't process why two of the most important adults in her life seemed to be at war with each other over something she couldn't understand. Brooklyn watched her daughter's confusion with heartbreak, realizing that Madison was being traumatized by the adult conflict surrounding her, that every encounter between the warring factions was adding to the child's emotional burden and psychological damage. This innocent child was being forced to navigate emotions and situations that no child should ever have to experience, and Brooklyn felt the crushing weight of responsibility for exposing Madison to this painful scene. Helen immediately took control of the situation with the practiced efficiency of someone who had anticipated this exact scenario and prepared her response accordingly. She spoke to Madison in a voice that was superficially gentle but carried undertones of authority and control that brooked no argument or resistance from the confused child. Helen told Madison that her mother was supposed to stay away from school and that this unexpected visit was not part of their agreed-upon schedule, carefully framing Brooklyn's desperate attempt to see her daughter as a violation of rules rather than an act of maternal love and desperation. Helen's words were chosen to plant seeds of doubt in Madison's mind about her mother's reliability and respect for boundaries, subtly reinforcing the narrative that Brooklyn was unpredictable and potentially problematic. Brooklyn watched in horror as Helen began the process of turning Madison against her in real time, using the child's natural trust in adult authority to manipulate her understanding of the situation and cast Brooklyn as the one creating problems and instability in Madison's life. Brooklyn realized that staying and fighting with Helen in front of Madison would only traumatize the child further and provide Helen with more evidence of her supposed instability and poor judgment regarding Madison's emotional well-being. With her heart breaking into pieces, Brooklyn made the painful decision to step back and allow Helen to take Madison away, knowing that prolonging this confrontation would only hurt her daughter and give Helen more ammunition for her legal case. Brooklyn knelt down one last time and told Madison that she loved her more than anything in the world, that she would always be her mommy no matter what happened, and that she was working very hard to make sure they could spend more time together very soon. The words felt inadequate and possibly untrue given the legal realities of her situation. But Brooklyn needed Madison to know that her mother's love was constant and unwavering even when their time together was limited by forces beyond Brooklyn's control. As Brooklyn watched Helen lead Madison away toward her expensive car, she felt like a piece of her soul was being torn away with every step that increased the distance between them. After Helen's car disappeared from sight with Madison inside, Brooklyn stood alone in the empty school parking lot feeling more defeated and hopeless than she had ever felt in her entire life. The brief reunion with Madison had been both a blessing and a curse, a precious reminder of the unbreakable bond between them, but also a devastating illustration of how much power Helen wielded over their relationship and how easily that power could be used to inflict maximum emotional damage on both mother and child. Brooklyn realized that Helen would use this incident as further evidence of her unpredictability and disregard for established boundaries, probably adding it to her growing file of documentation about Brooklyn's supposed unfitness as a mother and potential danger to Madison's stability. The school encounter had backfired spectacularly, giving Helen more ammunition while providing Brooklyn with only a few precious minutes of connection with her daughter before being forced to watch that connection be severed once again by forces beyond her control. Brooklyn sat in her car and sobbed, feeling like she was fighting a war where every battle she lost made victory less likely and the stakes higher, while Helen seemed to anticipate her every move and counter it with devastating effectiveness. The very next day, Savannah called Brooklyn with news that would change everything and provide the first real hope they had experienced since this nightmare began consuming their lives. Through her careful investigation and networking within their community, Savannah had uncovered evidence that Helen's character assassination campaign was even more extensive and malicious than they had initially realized. But she had also discovered cracks in Helen's seemingly perfect facade that could potentially be exploited to expose the truth. Savannah had spoken with several people who had grown uncomfortable with Helen's constant negative commentary about Brooklyn, and some had even begun to question whether Helen's version of events was entirely accurate, given their own positive experiences with Brooklyn over the years. Most importantly, Savannah had discovered that Helen had been caught in several outright lies about Brooklyn's behavior and mental state, contradictions that could potentially be used to undermine her credibility if they could find the right way to bring these inconsistencies to light in a legal setting where truth and evidence mattered more than social standing and financial resources. Savannah had compiled a comprehensive dossier of Helen's lies and manipulations, documenting every false claim, every contradictory statement, and every piece of evidence that proved Helen had been systematically fabricating evidence to support her narrative about Brooklyn's supposed unfitness as a mother. The documentation included screenshots of social media posts where Helen had claimed Brooklyn was dangerous, followed by photos from the same time period showing Brooklyn peacefully interacting with Madison during supervised visits, completely contradicting Helen's claims about Brooklyn's erratic and threatening behavior. Savannah had also discovered that Helen had told different versions of the same stories to different people, changing details and escalating the severity of Brooklyn's supposed transgressions depending on her audience and what reaction she was trying to provoke. These inconsistencies in Helen's narrative created opportunities to challenge her credibility and expose the deliberate nature of her campaign to destroy Brooklyn's reputation and relationship with Madison through systematic deception and emotional manipulation. But the most significant development in their investigation came when Pastor William from their church contacted Brooklyn directly, asking to meet with her privately to discuss some disturbing information he had received about the custody situation and Helen's role in spreading rumors throughout their religious community. Pastor William had known Brooklyn and Madison for years, had witnessed Brooklyn's devotion to her daughter and her faith, and had grown increasingly uncomfortable with Helen's constant negative commentary about Brooklyn's character and mental state during their conversations about the baptism planning and family dynamics. The pastor revealed that he had initially believed Helen's claims about Brooklyn's instability because of Helen's reputation and generous contributions to the church, but recent events and conversations had made him question whether he was getting the complete truth about the situation. Pastor William's willingness to meet with Brooklyn and hear her side of the story represented the first crack in Helen's carefully constructed narrative and the first adult in a position of authority who was willing to question Helen's version of events. During their private meeting in his church office, Pastor William shared information that shocked Brooklyn and provided crucial insight into the extent of Helen's manipulation within their religious community. Helen had told the pastor that Brooklyn had threatened to disrupt Madison's baptism ceremony, that she had sent inappropriate and disturbing messages to Tyler and other family members, and that she had exhibited erratic behavior during custody exchanges that had frightened Madison and caused the child to have recurring nightmares about her mother. None of these claims were true, but Helen's reputation as a pillar of the community and her generous financial support of church activities had given her words considerable weight and credibility among the congregation and clergy. Pastor William admitted that he had been influenced by Helen's apparent concern for Madison's well-being and her claims that Brooklyn's presence at the baptism would traumatize the child and disrupt the sacred nature of the ceremony. However, recent conversations with other church members and his own observations of Brooklyn's character over the years had made him increasingly suspicious that Helen might be manipulating the situation for her own purposes rather than acting in Madison's best interests. Pastor William revealed that he had always harbored private concerns about Helen's intense involvement in Tyler and Madison's lives, and her obvious animosity toward Brooklyn had struck him as potentially unhealthy for everyone involved, especially for Madison, who was caught in the middle of this adult conflict. The pastor admitted that Helen's constant criticism of Brooklyn and her attempts to control every aspect of the baptism planning had made him uncomfortable, particularly when she insisted that Brooklyn be completely excluded from the ceremony without any opportunity for compromise or mediation. Pastor William had suggested family counseling or mediation to help resolve the custody issues, but Helen had dismissed these suggestions and insisted that Brooklyn was too unstable and dangerous for any form of direct communication or negotiation. The pastor's growing discomfort with Helen's absolutist position and her refusal to consider any solution that included Brooklyn had made him begin to question whether Helen's motives were as pure and child-focused as she claimed them to be in their conversations about the family situation. Brooklyn felt overwhelming relief and validation as Pastor William listened to her side of the story, without judgment or preconceived notions about her character or mental state. For the first time in months, Brooklyn was able to speak honestly about her experiences with Helen's manipulation, her love for Madison, and her desperate desire to maintain a meaningful relationship with her daughter despite the legal and emotional obstacles that had been systematically placed in her path. Pastor William asked thoughtful questions about Brooklyn's relationship with Madison, her experiences during supervised visits, and her feelings about the custody arrangement and Helen's involvement in the situation. Brooklyn's honest, emotional responses and her obvious love for Madison made a powerful impression on the pastor, who began to see clear contradictions between Helen's claims about Brooklyn's character and the woman sitting across from him in his office. The pastor's willingness to listen and his growing skepticism about Helen's narrative gave Brooklyn the first real hope she had felt since discovering her exclusion from Madison's baptism ceremony. After listening to Brooklyn's story and comparing it with his own observations and the inconsistencies he had noticed in Helen's narrative, Pastor William made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire custody battle and expose Helen's manipulation to scrutiny for the first time. The pastor revealed that Brooklyn had written several beautiful letters to Madison over the years, expressing her love, hopes, and dreams for her daughter's future, and that these letters had been given to him for safekeeping during a particularly difficult period in their custody dispute. Pastor William had forgotten about these letters until recently, but now he realized that they represented powerful evidence of Brooklyn's true character and her genuine love for Madison, completely contradicting Helen's claims about Brooklyn's instability and unfitness as a mother. The pastor decided that these letters needed to be shared publicly during Madison's baptism ceremony as a testimony to the power of maternal love and forgiveness, and as a way to expose the truth about Brooklyn's character to the congregation and family members who had been influenced by Helen's lies and manipulation. This decision represented a turning point in the battle for Madison's future and the first real challenge to Helen's control over the narrative surrounding Brooklyn's relationship with her daughter. Brooklyn was stunned to learn about the existence of these letters, having forgotten that she had entrusted them to Pastor William during one of the darkest periods of her custody battle, when she feared that Helen might succeed in completely severing her relationship with Madison. The letters represented Brooklyn's most private thoughts and feelings about motherhood, her hopes for Madison's future, her regrets about the divorce and its impact on their family, and her unwavering love for her daughter despite all the obstacles that had been placed between them. Pastor William explained that the letters were beautiful expressions of maternal love and wisdom, filled with the kind of genuine emotion and authentic concern that no amount of manipulation or fabrication could replicate or fake. The pastor believed that reading excerpts from these letters during the baptism ceremony would not only honor Brooklyn's role as Madison's mother, but would also expose the congregation to the truth about Brooklyn's character and love for her daughter, potentially undermining Helen's carefully constructed narrative about Brooklyn's unfitness and instability as a parent and human being. Pastor William and Brooklyn began planning how to use the baptism ceremony as an opportunity to expose Helen's lies and restore Brooklyn's rightful place in Madison's life and their religious community. The pastor explained that he had the authority to structure the ceremony according to his pastoral judgment, and that he could include readings and testimonies that honored all aspects of Madison's family relationships, including her bond with her mother despite the current custody restrictions. Pastor William suggested that reading from Brooklyn's letters during the ceremony would provide a powerful counter-narrative to Helen's claims about Brooklyn's character, and that the emotional impact of these authentic expressions of maternal love would make it impossible for the congregation to continue believing Helen's lies about Brooklyn's instability and unfitness. The plan was risky because it would directly challenge Helen's control over the narrative and potentially expose Brooklyn to further retaliation. But it also represented the best opportunity they had encountered to fight back against Helen's manipulation and restore some measure of truth and justice to the situation that had destroyed Brooklyn's relationship with her daughter. As Brooklyn left the church that evening, she felt a sense of hope and determination that had been absent from her life for months, finally believing that she might have found a way to fight back against Helen's manipulation and reclaim her rightful place in Madison's life. Pastor William's willingness to question Helen's narrative and his decision to use the baptism ceremony as an opportunity to share Brooklyn's letters represented the first real challenge to Helen's seemingly unshakable control over the situation and the first adult in a position of authority who was willing to stand up for Brooklyn's rights as Madison's mother. The plan was far from guaranteed to succeed, and Brooklyn knew that Helen would retaliate viciously if she discovered what they were planning. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Brooklyn felt like she had allies who were willing to fight for the truth and for Madison's best interests rather than simply accepting Helen's version of events without question. The baptism ceremony that had originally been designed to exclude and humiliate Brooklyn might instead become the venue for her vindication and the beginning of Helen's downfall. If everything went according to plan, and Pastor William had the courage to follow through on his promises when the moment of truth arrived. 2 days after their initial meeting, Brooklyn returned to Pastor William's office to finalize their plan for the baptism ceremony and review the letters that would potentially change everything in her battle against Helen's manipulation. The pastor had spent considerable time reading through Brooklyn's heartfelt letters to Madison, and his eyes were filled with emotion as he described the beautiful expressions of maternal love and wisdom contained within those pages. Pastor William told Brooklyn that her letters revealed a devoted mother's heart, filled with hopes, dreams, prayers, and unconditional love for her daughter despite all the obstacles that had been placed between them. The authenticity and depth of emotion in these letters stood in stark contrast to Helen's claims about Brooklyn's instability and unfitness as a mother, providing powerful evidence that the congregation needed to see to understand the truth about their family situation. Pastor William had carefully selected specific excerpts from Brooklyn's letters that would be most appropriate for reading during a baptism ceremony, while still conveying the depth of her love for Madison and her commitment to being the best mother possible. The letters contain beautiful passages about Brooklyn's hopes for Madison's spiritual growth, her prayers for her daughter's happiness and success, and her promises to always be there for Madison no matter what challenges life might bring. One particularly moving letter described Brooklyn's dreams of watching Madison grow up, graduate from school, fall in love, and perhaps become a mother herself someday, with Brooklyn there to support and guide her through all of life's important moments. These expressions of maternal love and long-term commitment directly contradicted Helen's narrative about Brooklyn being an unstable, temporary presence in Madison's life who posed a threat to the child's well-being and future development. As Brooklyn listened to Pastor William read excerpts from her own letters, she was overwhelmed by the memories of writing those words during some of the darkest moments of her custody battle, when she feared she might lose Madison forever. The letters represented her most private thoughts and feelings about motherhood, written during late nights when she couldn't sleep because she missed her daughter so desperately that it felt like a physical pain in her chest. Brooklyn remembered pouring her heart onto those pages, expressing all the love, hopes, and dreams that she couldn't share with Madison in person because of the custody restrictions and Helen's interference. Hearing her own words read back to her by Pastor William made Brooklyn realize how powerful these letters could be in exposing the truth about her character and her relationship with Madison to people who had been influenced by Helen's lies and manipulation. Pastor William explained his strategy for incorporating Brooklyn's letters into the baptism ceremony in a way that would honor Madison while also exposing the truth about her mother's love and character to the assembled congregation. He planned to frame the reading as a celebration of all the people who loved Madison and supported her spiritual journey, including her mother, whose love remained constant despite the current family difficulties. The pastor would explain that Brooklyn had written these letters as prayers and blessings for Madison's future, and that sharing them during the baptism ceremony was a way to ensure that Madison knew she was surrounded by love from all directions. This approach would make it difficult for Helen to object without appearing cruel and manipulative, while also providing the congregation with clear evidence that contradicted Helen's claims about Brooklyn's character and fitness as a mother. Brooklyn felt a mixture of hope and terror as she contemplated the potential consequences of Pastor William's plan to expose Helen's lies during the baptism ceremony. On one hand, this represented her best opportunity to fight back against Helen's character assassination and show the world the truth about her love for Madison and her commitment to being a good mother despite all the obstacles placed in her path. On the other hand, Brooklyn knew that Helen would retaliate viciously if she discovered what they were planning, and that the confrontation during the ceremony could potentially traumatize Madison or backfire in ways that would give Helen even more ammunition for a legal case. The risk was enormous, but Brooklyn realized that doing nothing would guarantee Helen's victory and the permanent loss of her relationship with Madison, while fighting back at least offered the possibility of exposing the truth and reclaiming her rightful place in her daughter's life. Pastor Williams sensed Brooklyn's anxiety about the potential risks of their plan and spent considerable time reassuring her that he would handle the situation with wisdom, compassion, and respect for Madison's well-being above all other considerations. The pastor explained that he had been carefully observing Helen's behavior and statements for months, and that her constant negativity and attempts to control every aspect of the baptism planning had raised serious red flags about her motives and mental state. Pastor William admitted that he had initially been influenced by Helen's reputation and financial contributions to the church, but that her refusal to consider any compromise or mediation regarding Brooklyn's involvement had made him increasingly suspicious about the truth of her claims. The pastor assured Brooklyn that he would present the letters in a way that honored Madison and celebrated maternal love without directly attacking Helen, allowing the truth to speak for itself rather than creating unnecessary drama or conflict during the sacred ceremony. As their planning session concluded, Pastor William asked Brooklyn to sign a document giving him permission to read from her letters during the baptism ceremony, ensuring that everything was done with proper authorization and legal protection. Brooklyn's hand trembled slightly as she signed the papers that would potentially change the course of her life and her relationship with Madison, but she felt a sense of righteous determination that had been absent from her life for months. This was her chance to fight back against Helen's manipulation and show the world who she really was as a mother and as a person, rather than the distorted image that Helen had been spreading throughout their community. The letters represented her authentic voice and genuine love for Madison, and sharing them publicly would either vindicate her completely or expose her to even greater persecution. But Brooklyn knew that she had to take this risk if she ever hoped to reclaim her rightful place in her daughter's life. After Brooklyn left his office, Pastor William began making the necessary arrangements to ensure that their plan could be executed successfully during the baptism ceremony without alerting Helen to what was coming. The pastor contacted the church staff to discuss the ceremony logistics and the timing of the letter readings, ensuring that everything would flow smoothly and that Madison would be surrounded by love and support during this important spiritual milestone. Pastor William also reached out to several congregation members who had expressed private concerns about Helen's treatment of Brooklyn, quietly letting them know that the upcoming baptism ceremony would include some special elements that honored all aspects of Madison's family relationships. These preparations required careful coordination and timing to ensure that Helen couldn't interfere with the plan once the ceremony began, while also maintaining the sacred and celebratory nature of the baptism itself. That evening, Brooklyn spent hours at home preparing herself emotionally and spiritually for what could be the most important day of her life since Madison was born. She prayed for wisdom, courage, and the strength to handle whatever Helen might do when the truth about Brooklyn's character was revealed to the congregation and family members who had been influenced by months of lies and manipulation. Brooklyn also spent time writing in her journal, processing her feelings about the upcoming ceremony and her hopes for the future of her relationship with Madison. She knew that regardless of how the baptism ceremony unfolded, she would always be Madison's mother, and that their bond could never be completely severed by Helen's psychological warfare and legal maneuvering. The letters that Pastor William would read represented the truest expression of her love for Madison, and Brooklyn felt peace knowing that her daughter would finally hear those words of love and blessing, even if the circumstances weren't ideal. As Brooklyn prepared for bed that night, she looked at a framed photograph of Madison and whispered a prayer for her daughter's happiness and spiritual well-being during the upcoming baptism ceremony. Brooklyn knew that tomorrow would bring either vindication and the beginning of healing for their fractured family, or further persecution and potentially devastating consequences for her legal case and future relationship with Madison. But regardless of the outcome, Brooklyn felt a sense of peace and determination that had been absent from her life for months, knowing that she had finally found a way to fight back against Helen's manipulation and share the truth about her love for Madison with the world. The letters that Pastor William would read contained Brooklyn's most authentic self and her deepest love for her daughter, and she trusted that those words of genuine maternal devotion would touch hearts and expose the lies that had been poisoning their community's perception of her character and fitness as a mother. Sunday morning arrived with a mixture of hope and terror coursing through Brooklyn's veins as she drove toward the church, where Madison's baptism ceremony would either vindicate her completely or destroy any remaining chance she had of maintaining a relationship with her daughter. Brooklyn had barely slept the night before, alternating between prayers for courage and moments of paralyzing fear about what Helen might do when Pastor William revealed the truth about Brooklyn's character through her heartfelt letters to Madison. As she pulled into the church parking lot, Brooklyn's hands trembled on the steering wheel, but her resolve remained unshakable despite the enormous risks involved in challenging Helen's carefully constructed narrative about her fitness as a mother. This was her moment to fight back against months of psychological warfare and character assassination, as she refused to let fear prevent her from standing up for her rightful place in Madison's life. Brooklyn entered the church through a side door, hoping to avoid a confrontation with Helen before the ceremony began, and Pastor William had a chance to execute their carefully planned strategy for exposing the truth. The sanctuary was already filling with family members, friends, and congregation members who had come to celebrate Madison's baptism, many of whom had been influenced by Helen's months-long campaign of lies and manipulation regarding Brooklyn's character and mental state. Brooklyn could feel the weight of curious and sometimes hostile stares as she made her way to a seat in the back of the church, knowing that many of these people believed Helen's fabricated stories about her instability and unfitness as a mother. Despite the uncomfortable atmosphere and her own anxiety about what was to come, Brooklyn felt a sense of righteous determination, knowing that Pastor William would soon share her authentic words of love and devotion to Madison, potentially changing hearts and minds that had been poisoned against her. Helen's sharp eyes immediately spotted Brooklyn's presence in the church, and her face transformed from serene satisfaction to cold fury as she realized that her carefully orchestrated plan to exclude Brooklyn from this sacred milestone had been somehow circumvented. Helen had specifically instructed the church staff and Pastor William that Brooklyn was not to be permitted on the premises during the baptism ceremony, citing concerns about disruption and Madison's emotional well-being, but somehow Brooklyn had managed to gain entry despite these explicit restrictions. The older woman's mind immediately began calculating how to minimize the damage from Brooklyn's unexpected presence, while ensuring that this violation of her carefully established boundaries would be documented and used as further evidence of Brooklyn's disregard for authority and potential danger to Madison's stability. Helen's cold gray eyes never left Brooklyn as she began mentally preparing for whatever confrontation might unfold during what should have been her moment of complete triumph over her despised former daughter-in-law. Madison looked absolutely beautiful in her white baptism dress, her curly hair adorned with a simple flower crown that made her look like an angel as she stood near the altar with Tyler and other family members preparing for the sacred ceremony. The innocent joy on Madison's face as she participated in this important spiritual milestone was both heartwarming and heartbreaking for Brooklyn, who watched from her distant seat, knowing that she should have been standing beside her daughter during this momentous occasion. Madison's eyes occasionally scanned the congregation with the natural curiosity of a child, and Brooklyn felt her heart leap with hope and terror each time Madison's gaze moved in her direction, wondering if her daughter would spot her in the crowd and what kind of reaction that might provoke from Helen and the other adults who were determined to keep them separated. This beautiful ceremony should have been a celebration of family unity and spiritual growth, but instead it had become another battlefield in the ongoing war for Madison's future and Brooklyn's right to exist as her mother. Pastor William began the baptism ceremony with a beautiful message about God's love, family bonds, and the sacred responsibility of raising children in faith and wisdom, his words carefully chosen to prepare the congregation for what was coming without alerting Helen to the planned revelation. The pastor spoke eloquently about how children are blessed when they are surrounded by love from multiple sources: parents, grandparents, extended family, and the church community, and how that love helps shape their character and spiritual development throughout their lives. Brooklyn felt her heart pounding as Pastor William's words seemed to lay the groundwork for honoring her role as Madison's mother, despite Helen's attempts to erase her from this sacred moment and from Madison's life entirely. The congregation listened attentively to the pastor's opening remarks, unaware that they were about to hear a very different version of the Richardson family story than the one Helen had been spreading throughout their community for months. As Pastor William's sermon continued, Helen began to sense that something was different about his tone and emphasis, particularly his repeated references to the importance of maternal love and the sacred bond between mothers and children that transcends all earthly difficulties and challenges. Helen's eyes narrowed as she detected subtle changes in the pastor's usual baptism ceremony format, and her instincts told her that something was happening that she hadn't anticipated or approved in her careful planning of this event. The older woman's mind raced as she tried to determine whether Pastor William was simply delivering a generic message about family love or whether he was preparing to do something that would undermine her carefully constructed narrative about Brooklyn's unfitness as a mother. Helen's hands clenched in her lap as she realized that she might not have as much control over this ceremony as she had believed, and that Brooklyn's unexpected presence might be connected to whatever changes Pastor William had made to his planned remarks. Pastor William reached the pivotal moment in his sermon when he began to transition toward sharing Brooklyn's letters, explaining to the congregation that he wanted to honor all the people who loved Madison and had contributed to her spiritual and emotional development throughout her young life. The pastor spoke about the power of written words to express the deepest feelings of the human heart, and how some of the most beautiful expressions of love and hope come from parents who want to share their dreams and prayers for their children's futures. Brooklyn felt her breath catch in her throat as Pastor William began to explain that he had some special words of blessing and love from Madison that had been written by someone who cared deeply about her spiritual growth and happiness. The congregation listened with growing curiosity and attention, while Helen's face began to show signs of alarm as she realized that Pastor William was about to deviate significantly from the ceremony format they had discussed and approved. Brooklyn felt as though time had slowed to a crawl as Pastor William prepared to read from her letters, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the course of her relationship with Madison and potentially expose Helen's lies to everyone who had been turned against her through months of systematic character assassination. Every eye in the church was focused on Pastor William as he held up the letters that contained Brooklyn's most private thoughts and feelings about motherhood, love, and her hopes for Madison's future happiness and success. Brooklyn's heart pounded so loudly she was certain everyone in the church could hear it, and she found herself holding her breath as Pastor William began to speak the words that would either vindicate her completely or destroy any remaining hope she had of being part of Madison's life. The moment of truth had finally arrived, and there was no turning back from whatever consequences would follow from this bold challenge to Helen's control over their family narrative. The moment Pastor William began reading the first excerpt from Brooklyn's letters, Helen's face went white with shock and rage as she realized that her carefully orchestrated plan to exclude Brooklyn from Madison's baptism had been completely undermined by forces she hadn't anticipated or controlled. Helen's mind raced as she tried to determine how Brooklyn had managed to convince Pastor William to include her in the ceremony despite Helen's explicit instructions and warnings about Brooklyn's supposed instability and potential for disruption. The older woman's hands gripped the pew in front of her as she listened to Pastor William read Brooklyn's beautiful words of love and blessing from Madison. Words that directly contradicted every lie Helen had told about Brooklyn's character and fitness as a mother. Helen realized with growing horror that her entire campaign of character assassination was about to be exposed to the congregation and family members who had believed her stories, and that Brooklyn might actually succeed in reclaiming her rightful place in Madison's life through this unexpected turn of events. As Pastor William continued reading from Brooklyn's letters, Madison's young face began to show signs of recognition and emotional response to the familiar words of love and encouragement that her mother had written for her during their months of separation. The innocent child couldn't fully understand the complex adult dynamics that had led to this moment, but she could feel the authentic love and devotion in every word Pastor William read, and her natural maternal connection to Brooklyn began to stir despite all of Helen's attempts to poison her against her mother. Madison's eyes began scanning the congregation more actively, as if some instinct was telling her that the person who had written these beautiful words of love and blessing might be present in the church at that very moment. The tension in the sanctuary was palpable as the congregation absorbed the power and authenticity of Brooklyn's written expressions of maternal love, while Helen sat frozen in her pew, realizing that her carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation was beginning to crumble around her with each word Pastor William read from those precious letters. Pastor William's voice grew stronger and more emotional as he continued reading from Brooklyn's heartfelt letters to Madison, sharing words that revealed the depth of a mother's unconditional love and her unwavering commitment to her daughter's happiness and spiritual growth. The pastor read passages where Brooklyn wrote about her dreams of watching Madison graduate, fall in love, and become the amazing woman she was destined to be, with her mother there to support and guide her through every milestone. As these authentic expressions of maternal devotion filled the church sanctuary, the congregation began to understand that they had been hearing only one side of a much more complex story, and that the woman they had been told was unstable and dangerous was actually a loving mother who had been systematically separated from her child through manipulation and lies. The power of Brooklyn's written words began to shift the atmosphere in the church from judgment to understanding, from condemnation to compassion. Brooklyn sat in her pew with tears streaming down her face as she listened to Pastor William read her most private thoughts and feelings about motherhood. Words she had written during the darkest moments of her custody battle, when she feared she might lose Madison forever. Hearing her own expressions of love and hope read aloud in this sacred space, surrounded by people who had believed the worst about her character, felt like a moment of divine vindication and healing that she had never dared to hope for during the long months of psychological warfare and character assassination. The congregation's faces were beginning to change from suspicion to sympathy as they heard the authentic voice of a mother's heart. And Brooklyn could see that Pastor William's strategy was working to expose the truth about her relationship with Madison and her genuine love for her daughter. For the first time in months, Brooklyn felt like her true self was being seen and heard rather than the distorted image that Helen had been spreading throughout their community. Madison's innocent face showed growing recognition and emotional response as Pastor William continued reading the familiar words of love and encouragement that resonated deep in her young heart. Even though she couldn't fully understand why these particular words felt so meaningful and special to her. The child's natural instincts told her that these weren't just generic blessings or prayers, but deeply personal expressions of love from someone who knew her completely and cared about her happiness more than anything else in the world. Madison began turning in her white baptism dress to scan the congregation more actively, her 8-year-old mind somehow sensing that the person who had written these beautiful words of love and hope might be present in the church at that very moment. When Madison's searching eyes finally found Brooklyn sitting in the back of the church, the child's face lit up with pure joy and recognition, and she took an instinctive step toward her mother before remembering the adult rules and restrictions that had been keeping them apart. Helen could no longer contain her rage and desperation as she watched her carefully constructed world of lies and manipulation crumbling around her with each word Pastor William read from Brooklyn's letters. The older woman stood abruptly from her pew, her face twisted with fury and disbelief as she realized that Brooklyn had somehow managed to turn what should have been Helen's moment of complete triumph into a public vindication of everything Helen had tried to destroy. Helen's voice cut through the sacred atmosphere of the church as she demanded that Pastor William stop reading those letters immediately, claiming that they were inappropriate for a baptism ceremony and that Brooklyn had no right to be part of Madison's spiritual milestone. The congregation turned to stare at Helen with surprise and confusion, many of them beginning to see her true character for the first time as her mask, a concerned grandmother, slipped to reveal the controlling, manipulative woman beneath. Pastor William looked directly at Helen with calm authority and spiritual conviction as he explained that these letters were beautiful expressions of maternal love and blessing that honored Madison and celebrated the sacred bond between mother and child that no earthly force could ever truly sever. The pastor's voice carried the weight of his pastoral authority as he told Helen that he had carefully considered the appropriateness of including these letters in the ceremony, and that he believed they represented exactly the kind of love and devotion that should be celebrated during a child's baptism. Pastor William's firm but compassionate response to Helen's outburst made it clear to the entire congregation that he was acting from spiritual conviction rather than personal preference, and that Helen's attempt to silence these expressions of maternal love was inappropriate and potentially harmful to Madison's emotional and spiritual well-being. The pastor's courage in standing up to Helen's manipulation gave other congregation members permission to question the narrative they had been fed about Brooklyn's character and fitness as a mother. In that moment of truth and emotional revelation, Madison's natural love for her mother overcame all the adult restrictions and manipulations that had been keeping them apart, and the child broke free from the family group near the altar to run down the church aisle toward Brooklyn with arms outstretched and tears of joy streaming down her face. The sight of this innocent child choosing love over the artificial barriers that had been constructed around her was so powerful and moving that several congregation members began crying as they witnessed the reunion between mother and daughter that should never have been prevented in the first place. Madison's uninhibited sprint toward Brooklyn served as a powerful rebuke to everyone who had believed Helen's lies about Brooklyn being dangerous or harmful to her daughter, as it was clear that Madison felt nothing but love, trust, and desperate longing for her mother's embrace. The child's natural instincts and pure love cut through all the adult complications and legal manipulations to reveal the truth about the sacred bond between Brooklyn and Madison. Brooklyn caught Madison in her arms and held her daughter close, both of them crying tears of joy and relief as they were finally reunited in this sacred space, surrounded by witnesses who could see the genuine love and connection between them. The embrace between mother and daughter was so powerful and authentic that it silenced every doubt and criticism that had been raised about Brooklyn's fitness as a mother, proving beyond any question that Madison's love for Brooklyn was real, natural, and desperately needed for the child's emotional well-being. Brooklyn whispered words of love and reassurance to Madison, promising that she would never stop fighting for their relationship and that nothing would ever change her love for her daughter, no matter what obstacles might be placed in their path. The congregation watched this reunion with growing understanding of how wrong they had been to believe Helen's lies and how much damage had been done to an innocent family through manipulation and character assassination that had no basis in reality. Helen stood frozen in shock and defeat as she watched her entire campaign of lies and manipulation exposed and destroyed in front of the very people she had worked so hard to turn against Brooklyn. The older woman's face showed a mixture of rage, disbelief, and dawning realization that her carefully constructed narrative about Brooklyn's unfitness had been completely demolished by the simple truth of maternal love and the authentic connection between Brooklyn and Madison. Helen could see the changing expressions on the faces of congregation members as they began to understand how they had been deceived and manipulated into supporting a cruel separation between a loving mother and her innocent child. The woman who had seemed so powerful and controlling just moments before now appeared small and vindictive as her true character was revealed to everyone who had previously respected and believed her lies about Brooklyn's supposed instability and danger to Madison. Pastor William completed the baptism ceremony with a powerful message about forgiveness, redemption, and the triumph of love over hatred and manipulation, speaking directly to the hearts of congregation members who were beginning to understand their role in perpetuating injustice against Brooklyn and Madison through their willingness to believe lies without seeking the truth. The pastor explained that Madison's baptism represented not just her spiritual rebirth, but also the rebirth of truth and justice in their community and the restoration of the sacred bond between mother and child that should never have been threatened by adult conflicts and manipulations. As Pastor William performed the actual baptism, with both Brooklyn and Madison present and united, the ceremony became a powerful symbol of healing, forgiveness, and the ultimate victory of authentic love over the forces of manipulation and control that had nearly destroyed an innocent family. As the ceremony concluded and the congregation began to leave, many people approached Brooklyn to apologize for believing Helen's lies and to express their support for her relationship with Madison, finally understanding the truth about the loving mother who had been so cruelly maligned and separated from her daughter. Brooklyn felt overwhelming gratitude and relief as she realized that this baptism ceremony had indeed become the turning point in her battle for Madison, exposing Helen's manipulation and restoring her rightful place in her daughter's life and in their community. The road ahead would still have challenges as they worked to rebuild their relationship and heal from the trauma of their separation. But Brooklyn knew that truth and love had finally triumphed over lies and manipulation. Watching from around the world, we hope Brooklyn's story reminds you that a mother's love can overcome any obstacle. Where are you watching from today? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Give this story a like if it touched your heart, and subscribe for more incredible true stories of faith, family, and the power of never giving up on the people we love most.